Hi, everyone. My name is Holman Wang, and my presentation today is called From Bar Wars to Star Wars, How a Lawyer Came to Create Kids' Books in a Galaxy Far, Far Away. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my work, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my career transition as well. The reference to Bar Wars, of course, I used to fight many a battle at the bar. I used to be a lawyer, and in Canada we actually have to gown up for certain court proceedings. And so these are fairly preposterous photos, but the only ones I had of me actually wearing a gown. So there I am. But now I am no longer a lawyer. I quit in December 2012, and now I do kids' books. And the most recent series of books that I've done is called Star Wars Epic Yarns, where we being my brother and I, my brother Jack, we abridge each of the original Star Wars movies into word primers that are just 12 words and 12 images. And we have a particular illustration technique which we use, which is called needle felting. And I will talk more about that later, but very quickly right now, there are the cast of characters, most of the cast of characters for the books that are made out of wool. And then, like I said, we abridge the books to 12 words and 12 illustrations. So there is a typical spread would look something like this: Captain, and there's Han Solo and Greedo. In our world, Han shoots first, of course. In fact, Greedo doesn't have a gun at all. And here's another image of Jabba the Hutt paired with the word monster. And the spread of the books looks like this. So this is how the actual books look. And they are board book format, so nice and chunky, fairly indestructible for young children. Now, I'm going to back up the narrative a little bit to tell you a little bit about my life. My brother and I were born in Taiwan, and we came to Canada when we were 1.5, and this is our first birthday in Canada. And we were big Star Wars fans when we were kids. So here is a picture of Jack and I. Jack has the lightsaber, and I'm in the kung fu pose. I like to think of this picture as a crouching tiger, not so hidden lightsaber. And it's funny because I was at a school presentation and I said, well, this is sort of kung fu meets Star Wars. And one of the little kids said, no, that's not kung fu. That's the Emperor with zapping, Luke Skywalker with his Force lightning, which I thought was quite clever, except they didn't have the heart to tell him that Return of the Jedi had not actually come out by this point. But at any rate, my brother and I were always quite artistic as young kids. Here we are, some random art contest. I don't even remember what it was. We look fairly enthused about winning. I'm not sure about that girl, though. Fast forwarding to high school, here are my brother and I coaching the grade 10 girls basketball team to the Vancouver City Championships. There we are in the background. But I'll be perfectly honest, we were probably less jock and more Spock in high school because we were, in fact, science fair kings. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we were science fair kings. We went to the National Science Fair in Canada 4 times, and that sort of led to a meandering, wayward career trajectory for me. Because we did most of our science fair projects in plant physiology, I wound up, I call this my overeducated and underemployed period of my life. So first I went to university, originally to study biology, but then I thought that was not really to my interest, so I sort of shifted gears a little bit and did a double major in biology and anthropology. And then I wasn't sure what to do with my life after that, so I went to get a bachelor in education to teach middle school. And then after that, I thought, well, I don't really want to teach either, so I'm going to become an architect. That's more creative. So I spent a year in the architecture design program and then decided that wasn't for me either. So I dropped out and just hung around the department and did a master's of architecture history, apropos of nothing, really. And then did a number of non-career related jobs. And then when I was 30, decided maybe I should get my act together and I should go to back to law school and get my law degree. And that was what I did. So after I got my law degree, I was more well employed than I had been in the past. And here I am on the day that I got called to the bar. Strange thing happened, though, after a couple of years of practicing as a lawyer. I developed a cough that would never go away. It would actually get worse when I wanted to go to court, and it was sort of some high stress situation. And the doctors tested for tuberculosis and asthma and heart conditions and cancer and all sorts of things. And at the end of the day, the doctor told me it was a psychogenic cough, which meant that the genesis was in my psyche, or that, that I basically was so depressed or had such underlying stress or anxiety about the career that I had chosen that it was manifesting itself in this way. And so it became clear to me that, I needed to make a career shift at some point. I wasn't exactly sure what that would be. Here's my office on the 32nd floor. You can see that there are a number of pieces of paper that I've collected over the years on the wall. And then I brought all those plants in because I thought maybe I was on the 32nd floor and couldn't breathe because there wasn't enough oxygen up there. And so anyways, this is my office. And I was, it's about 5 or 6 years ago, and my brother came to me one day and said, I know I've got this idea for kids' books. It was almost as a joke at first, because he wanted to abridge theorists, like really high-level theorists like Freud and Jung, and say, why don't we make baby books for them out of those theorists, and be kind of just a joke thing. But then we got to talking, and then he had a more serious proposal, which was, why don't we abridge classics for very young children in just a couple of words? Because we had gotten very used to reading a lot of word primers to our very young children, and word primers, they can tend to get a little stale. Barnyard animals, shapes, colors. These are all very important things, but after a while, they're a little bit boring, frankly, for parents. And sometimes the art in the books is also a little bit stale, clip art or stock photography. So here I actually have a picture of a word primer, which I didn't want to offend any North American publishers, so I've gone to an overseas publication here, and it's bilingual. And you see, there's all kinds of issues here. Instead of my actions, it says my acting here, and then apparently children grovel and creep, and then this little boy here in the blue box is ready for life in the 17th century here. So anyways, this is the kind of thing that you tend to, that you, not always, but very often experience with word primers. And we thought, how can we make word primers more exciting? Why do they always have to be concept books? Why can't they be story books? Why can't they have a narrative for young children? So that's when we came up with the idea of needle felting some figures. I hope this video works. Here's a time-lapse video. And needle felting is a technique where you take loose wool roving and you basically stab it again and again with a specialized barbed needle. And what that does is it entangles the fibers. And when you entangle the fibers, it gets firmer and firmer, and then you can start to sculpt with it. So here I've bulked out the body, and then now I'm adding the details to this particular figure, which happens to be Mr. Rochester from Jane Eyre. And we thought that would be a great way to illustrate children's books. And so this is the very first concept illustration that we did. This is for Moby Dick, and this is Ishmael from Moby Dick. And originally it was this idea that we might even just use paper backgrounds with, old woodcut prints or maps and that kind of thing. Very gestural, very simple. And then we also explored the possibility of illustrating two-dimensionally with wool. And here you can see we've illustrated a stormy sea and a boat that's lost. But ultimately, we rejected this concept in favor of taking the wool figures and either building three-dimensional sets for them, or taking them actually out on location and shooting them in natural environments. So our first two books are that came out in late 2012 were Moby Dick and Pride and Prejudice. And you see, this is the entire book is just 12 words and 12 images. And here we have Mr. Darcy refusing to dance with Lizzie Bennet and paired with the word mean. There's Captain Ahab with his peg leg from Moby Dick. This is Andrei Bolkonsky and Natasha Rostova from War and Peace. And that's Pierre Bezukhov sort of looking on jealously during the dance in the middle there. So the idea is that for very young children, this is Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester kissing. So the idea is that for very young children, they're just simple word primers. You can just illustrate simple concepts, simple words, kiss, dance, that kind of thing. As children get a little bit older, they're 4, 5, or 6, they become storytelling vehicles because their narrative, parents can fill in the detail, and if you know the story, you can fill in the details. Even if you don't know the story, it doesn't matter. You know, the idea is to use your imaginations. You can get your kids to tell you the story, what's happening from one picture to the next. There's no wrong way to read our books. So we found that as we got along into this project of abridging classics, the illustrations really got more and more involved. Here we are building an entire sort of miniature forest, and that's Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn in the forest for this shot of them camping. And sometimes it's possible to take things and do them on location, but when you have them around a campfire, everything has to be at a smaller scale. You just wind up having to build the whole thing. Here I am in some very sexy hip waders that I borrowed from a friend, and just got right out into the muddy slough with a little raft. There's Huck and Jim from Huckleberry Finn, and I was able to get this shot. So I was actually in the slough with a camera, frightened that I was going to slip and, you know, lose my $1,500 camera. But it's just all part of trying to get the right image for these books. Now, it's sort of interesting because, you know, there was a particular trend in children's books to, you know, to really stay away from adult themes, to really sanitize things, you know, have a lot of pink bunnies and magical unicorns and things that are really not, kind of divorced from real life and sort of this insulated world of children's books. And it's illustrated perfectly by this New Yorker cartoon. There's these two kids here, they're watching television, there's two animals, and there's the word respect at the top. And it says, everything I know about being human, I learned from animals. And, you know, there is this kind of trend that we have to teach lessons through animals and through some kind of slightly sanitized world. And so we're taking a different approach. You know, we think that some of these great classics, these stories that people love, have lessons that you can actually share with children. Of course, it's totally up to the adult, right, what you share at any one point, because those lessons are not embedded in the story per se. There's only 12 words, right? But kids are curious, and my own kids ask me questions. We have other parents who tell us that they have very inquisitive children who ask questions about what's going on, what's the motivation that's going on with particular characters, and parents can sort of adapt their answers to their particular to their child at the appropriate age. And so people seem to like our books. This is sort of the neatest piece of publicity we probably got, which is in People magazine, sharing you know, with the cover graced by Brangelina. And so that takes us to 2013, when we exhibited some of our artwork at the Bologna Children's Book Fair. And that's the world's largest book fair where publishers and authors and illustrators and agents, the biggest book fair for children's books, and people go and sell rights and that sort of thing. There's also an illustrators exhibition there, and we are very fortunate to have some of our Pride and Prejudice images selected for the exhibition. So we had a chance to go to Italy, use it as an excuse to take our wives there, and you know, look, you don't need to be a lawyer to have a wonderful, glamorous life. You could be a kids illustrator. We can go to Italy. This is part of what I'm selling the career change, how I'm selling the career change to my wife. But importantly, while we were there, we met a representative from Chronicle Books who took some of our cozy classics back to the head of the children's department at Chronicle, and she liked our books and talked to us about doing a new project. And she said, well, what are you guys interested in doing? And we just thought, well, why don't we just shoot for the moon and say Star Wars, because, and we grew up with Star Wars. This is Star Wars to us, the original trilogy, with all due respect to the young children who think that Jar Jar Binks is the bee's knees. This is Star Wars for us. And Lucasfilm sort of said, interesting, 12 words, needle-felted characters. Why don't you needle felt something for us? Let's see what you guys can do in the Star Wars universe. And so we did this. This is our very first figure. It's Luke in an X-Wing costume, and we sent these images to Lucas, and that's what sort of got us the gig. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through A New Hope for you in 12 words, so you get a sense of how our books actually work, sort of cover to cover. So here we go. Princess, trouble, boy, learn, captain, space, help, garbage, swing, duel, fly, and finally, heroes. And that's Star Wars in 12 words. And so, like I said, for very young children, it's a word primer. They get to learn, you get to say, hey, look, the spaceship is flying. With my own children who are 3 and 5, we sit down and I, do my, best or worst Chewbacca imitation, as the case may be, Yoda imitations, Darth Vader impressions, just sort of have some fun with it. It's a storytelling vehicle. And I know that lots of adults like our books because they're just kind of fun and they're ironic. That's a story that they love has been abridged into 12 words. So they keep it around as a coffee table book. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just talk a little bit more about the process of creating the books. What you didn't see in the video is that the figures all start with a wire armature. So that helps us, one, get this general size of the figure sort of mapped out beforehand. All of these Star Wars figures are done at an exact 1:7 scale so that all the relative heights of the characters are correct. But more importantly, the wire armature allows the figures to be posed and reposed, and then you can put them into the various action poses. So then you see, as you wind the roving around and you stab it, it starts to entangle and you start to bulk up the bodies. And then here you see a half-completed Luke. We had one question, early on that troubled us, which was how we're going to deal with all these elaborate Star Wars costume changes and keep character continuity, because we knew we couldn't, do a whole bunch of different Luke heads and make them look, exactly the same. So we came up with a system of removable heads, so that Luke's head could actually pop off and go to another body with another costume. And for those of you who are in the room, I can do a quick demonstration. See this? Luke's head just comes right off right here like that. And then the stormtrooper head comes off. And then, you see, now Luke is ready for the Death Star, you see. So that saved us a lot of time because we didn't have to destroy costumes. But at the same time, we were able to maintain character continuity and do elaborate costume changes. Other figures like R2-D2 started off, again, very simply. This cross piece is where his legs would fit into, and then you'd bulk up his body into this cylinder, felt the top part, and then top part just fits onto the wire that's sticking out, and then his head can rotate. And then we had to do slightly different techniques for the legs because needle felting is very good for sort of soft, curvy elements. It's harder to create hard edges with wool. So what we did is we took craft felt, which you can get at any kind of craft store that kids cut up and make two-dimensional illustrations with. We took that craft felt and glued it into layers in order to ultimately achieve the hard edges of R2-D2's legs. Now, for Darth Vader, we knew that we wanted his eyes to have a different texture. So they couldn't be wool. We wanted them to catch and reflect light a little bit differently. So I was sitting around my studio one day and thinking about what that could be, that material, and I saw a beer can just sitting there, and it was painted black, and I thought, oh, I could just cut up some of this aluminum from the beer can. So then I cut out some ovals and glued that on top of the wool, and Darth Vader literally has beer goggles on. But it does a very effective job of capturing the light. We really wanted to be true to Star Wars, get things right, because we know that Star Wars fans are very discerning. So Princess Leia actually features 9 different hairstyles through the 3 books, because of course her hairstyles are famous, and we had to get them all right. Most of all the humanoid figures are wool through and through. Some of the larger figures start off with a styrofoam core, just because it would save hours and hours of this sort of felting and bulking up. So we would put styrofoam boards together, glue them into a large block, and then we would start shaving it down with a hot melting tool, and then just sort of shave it down, and you know who this is going to be. And there I am with the studio set up with a visit from my children. And you've already seen this shot. Jabba the Hutt. The same technique was used for the Tauntaun. And there I bought a little plastic Tauntaun to try to copy the proportions. And there's the final Tauntaun with Luke on it. And then I took this out to a local ski hill to shoot this. And it's kind of an illusion, because he looks like he's on a, sort of a, rocky outcropping, and there's snow on it. In fact, it's just a snow pile that's been pushed to the side of the parking lot by a plow. And the parts that look like rocks, it's just dirt. It's just dirty snow. But it creates the illusion of it being like a rocky hillside. It worked very effectively. Some of the other sets required very elaborate cut pieces. And so I would start with a paper template, for example. I would draw it out to know exactly what I was cutting. And in this case, this is part of the blockade runner scene where Princess Leia is putting the Death Star plans into R2-D2. And I just used pliable foam and cut out holes on the top level, and then put another level in the back to create these indentations. Sprayed the foam with a metallic paint. Started to set those pieces up. Tested some lighting. And then basically just kind of, a lot of these shots involve a lot of MacGyvering, because you're just kind of figuring it up as you go along. You need some red lighting in the background. You need light at this angle. You can see at the front light, it's a little bit too wide. So I've put tin foil on to narrow the focus of the light at the front. Because they don't really make lights to work at this small scale, or at least I haven't found any. So I sort of jimmy the equipment that I have. And that was the princess scene. The most complicated set to build was possibly the blockade runner hallway, because it had a lot of curved elements, which I had to make out of, again, pliable foam. And so I'd cut these elements to give it some rigidity. I used some foam core, and then I would put together a column like this, and then I would put together a whole number of columns, and then I would start to assemble them. Add the consoles, add the detailing, the flooring. Also needed to add some lighting panels for the ceiling, and then this is the finished hallway. And then I put the figures in. You can see it's all, there's all the top lighting. And then that's the final shot. So the whole process of making these 3 books took us about a year. We did about 5 months of needle felting before we even did any set making or photography. And we probably got most of the felt figures, but by all means, not all the figures done in the first 5 months. So some of the sets also started off with styrofoam, and then what we would do is we would add quickset concrete to texturize it. And then we would paint that concrete, and this is Ben Kenobi's hut. And then we would put the figures in, and this is the learn image that you saw earlier. This is another styrofoam and concrete set. This is the cantina booth. And sometimes some of these sets call for very simple electronics. There's a table lamp in this instance. And so here are the figures posed. And there's some lighting through the little small window at the back. And then ultimately, this is a shot that results. And because these books are supposed to be for very young children, potentially, we did make some modifications. We didn't want any drawn guns. So as I mentioned earlier, Han definitely shoots first in our version because Greedo doesn't have a gun at all. So he's just sort of pointing somewhat menacingly, but he actually has a gun in the movie, but there's no gun here. Some of the other, this is the beginnings of the Millennium Falcon cockpit, and it's just balsa wood. These colored circles at the top are actually embroidery hoops that you can get at a store like Michael's if you like to do needlepoint work. The wood circle at the bottom is something that someone might make a wreath with. So, when we were making these books, there was a lot of walking around hardware stores and craft stores and just looking at objects and going, can that be something else? There was a lot of plumbing parts that I was looking at in hardware stores thinking, could they become space components of spaceships? So it was sort of fun and also a bit of a challenge sometimes to find things that could serve as a prop. So then the interior of this cockpit gets painted. Some of the metallic elements at the very top, those are like model train parts. And then this is just a test shot of putting the Death Star into the shot. And then ultimately, the setup started to look like this. And it's a little bit difficult to see from this slide, but what's behind the Death Star is actually a piece of black cardstock with holes punched in it. And there's Christmas lights behind it. So that in the final shot, when you see stars, those are not computer illustrated. Those are actual lights coming through the cardstock. For the trash compactor scene, I actually had to get a iron-based paint that would rust when you applied an oxidizing solution. So this is the paint in the process of rusting. It starts off gray, and then when you add the solution, it starts to rust. And then ultimately, the walls look like that. And then I added the various pieces for the garbage, pieces of foam and rubber and metal and so on. Oh, actually, just there, there's some dirt on the walls that's sort of dripping down. And I just wound up putting coffee rinds and a little bit of oil onto the walls. And the oil actually started seeping into the walls and spreading a little bit. So I had to get my shot quickly before that oil just sort of got all over the place. So that was kind of at first I thought it was a clever move and then kind of backfired on me. So these are the things that you kind of figure out as you go along. This is the shot of Luke and Leia swinging across the Death Star where there's the broken bridge, and this is a shot from behind the Death Star walls, which are all backlit with lights. And you can see in the background Luke and Leia hanging by strings, so they are still and they don't move when I'm taking the shot. But as you can see from this angle, I've built the whole Death Star wall on a platform with wheels, so that when I take the shot, I'm actually pushing the Death Star wall to create a slight blur so that there is this kind of motion effect. And it's much more dramatic in the next sequence here with the X-Wing fighter. First of all, the X-Wing fighters or the spaceships in general were too delicate to needle felt in their entirety. So we built those out of cardboard and then put craft felt over top of the surfaces. And here are the components of the X-Wing fighter. Then I took the fuselage, put it on some pegs, and then started adding the wings. And there's the completed X-Wing fighter. And then for the Death Star wall, I knew I just needed to create a bunch of light and shadow. It didn't necessarily need to look like the Death Star per se. So I just took a whole bunch of insulation from, or styrofoam from electronics packages or whatever, and other garbage, and just glued it onto this large styrofoam board, painted it all gray, and then set it up behind the X-Wing fighter, and then did a long exposure shot. And then when that shot was taken, I pulled the wall very quickly, and then the final effect was like this. So it creates the illusion of flight. And then digitally, I remove those two pegs, so those aren't seen. Here is the Dagobah set. And this was kind of fun because, well, first of all, I got to get some tree branches and put some soil down. I took dried leaves and I actually put them in a blender to scale them down into little pieces. Took a bunch of yarn, painted them green to create all those hanging vines. But the really fun part was there's a couple of baking dishes you can see in the shot around the edges, and I filled those with hot water, and then I put dry ice in them to create the misty effects of Dagobah. And I have a video here, and I'll show you. Hope this works. Nope, let's see. Let's try that again. Oh, that video is not cooperating. So at any rate, we've got a still shot here, and you can see that the dry ice vapors are sort of coming out. The dry ice vapors are heavier than air, so they just kind of roll across the surface, and it creates that misty atmosphere of Dagobah. And there's the final shot. And it's a very subtle touch. You only see a little bit of the mist at the bottom, but again, it's not computer generated. Our goal is to try to do things in camera. This is just the setup for the shuttle Tidarium shot where they're flying to the Endor moon. And this is the final set. And there's the final image with all the characters in the shuttle. For the Endor scenes, I tried to get a tree stump from the forest and bring it home. If anyone's ever tried to do that, it's actually a very difficult task. One, because there are not tree stumps lying around for you to pick up and take home. And if you do see a whole fallen tree, it'll take you, 5 days to cut through it without a chainsaw. So I decided to just build my own cedar tree with cedar bark and just a styrofoam base. And that wound up in a number of shots. This is the interior of the Ewok village. And here I am using real fire. There's a little candle at the top by Wicket, and the fire in the middle. There's a couple of candles in there. And the final shot here, the word is story time. This is from Return of the Jedi. And then here's the tree for the outdoor scene in the Ewok village. And for this scene here where Luke tells Leia that they're related, they're brother and sister, I actually filled my entire studio / office with incense smoke just to create a little bit of that haze that's seen in the movie. So we just, we did whatever we could to try to recreate the tone and the feel of the movies. And those were the studio shots, and we also did some location shooting as well. I already showed you the shot of the Tauntaun. Here I am on Mount Seymour doing another Hoth scene. There's the felted Luke in the foreground. There's a cardboard snow speeder that's crashed, which we built. And then for the AT-AT, we thought, well, we're not going to reinvent the wheel. Let's just use that wonderful Kenner plastic AT-AT that we all remember from the 80s. And we got one of those, set that up in the background, and then the final shot looks like this. And I think, with blurring and people's understanding of the scale of the AT-AT, people are imagining there's a big menacing machine off in the distance. Here's cover for Return of the Jedi. And those are, again, the speeder bikes were too hard to make, so we decided to use toys again, and then we found perfectly scaled ones, and we put our felt figures on the speeder bike, set those up in the forest, and that wound up being the cover of Return of the Jedi. And I live in Vancouver. My brother, he is a writing professor. He lives in Ithaca, New York. But we decided, well, we need some desert. And there's no desert in Vancouver or New York. So we decided to come down to California to find it. And this, in fact, is the Imperial Sand Dunes where George Lucas filmed parts of Return of the Jedi. So we thought, why not just go back, make a pilgrimage of sorts to where George Lucas filmed. And here I am in the desert. And we got this shot down there of Luke rescuing Chewbacca and Han Solo from Jabba the Hutt. And we didn't know this, but it's incredibly windy in the desert. Maybe if you're from California, that's like an obvious thing, but these images of the desert seem quite tranquil, but it's actually violently windy out there. So, I managed to get my shot before like my whole set blew apart from the wind. Chewbacca fell over and broke the set. And in fact, there were parts of the set that fell down into a dune. It's like, I don't know if you've ever walked a dune, but it's kind of hard to go all the way down, 30, 40 feet into the dune and walk back up. And it just happened to be a couple of ATV riders bombing around in that area. And they were nice enough to go and fetch some of these pieces for me. And, and even though California does have desert, there's some things you can't find. And that is desert, at least, we couldn't find it. We didn't know where it was. Flat desert all the way to the horizon. All right, the images that of Tatooine, those were done in Tunisia by George Lucas. And so here we are in Arizona, and there's like cactuses everywhere and mountains. And so we knew we weren't going to find any flat desert. So we just decided to just dummy it up with a couple of cardboard boxes and a little bit of sand. And that wound up being the cover of A New Hope. And there we just created the illusion of that Tunisian desert. Okay, so that's the end of my discussion about how we made the books. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about my career change and come to this principle called ride mule, chase horse. And that's a literal translation of a Chinese proverb. And it means, just hang on to what you have while you're looking for something better. And even more directly, don't quit your day job. Your mule is your day job and the horse is the dream job. And for me, when I was making the transition, I was moonlighting as a children's illustrator for 3 years before I gave up my day job. And even today, I can't say that I've made it, as a children's illustrator. I might have to go and get a real job again sometime. I'm not sure. I hope to do this as long as I can. But, just when you're starting out, especially if you're downshifting, someone like me who had a well-paying, high-stress, sort of time-consuming job, if you want to downshift, sometimes people think that the best way to do that is to just throw it all away. Okay, I'm quitting today. I'm done. I want to go and pursue my dream. But the research actually shows if you're kind of an A-type personality, you sort of strive on a little bit of stress, you're gonna actually be bored. If you're just quitting your job and you're not sure exactly what you're gonna move on to, you're gonna feel the loss of status and the loss of financial freedom very acutely. So you're probably better off taking on more than less. So that's what I wound up doing for 3 years, is actually took on more. So I had very young children. I was working as a lawyer and basically used all my free time on evenings and weekends to work on the Cozy Classics books to try to get that started. So in those first 2.5 years, I only got 2 books done because I didn't have much time to do them. But it was certainly an outlet for me. I think that when you have a day job that sometimes you're a little bit frustrated by, you actually have more energy to put into your side pursuits. If that becomes your main pursuit, then maybe you're not using that energy that you sort of get from being frustrated from your day job and pouring it into, you know, your sideline. So that was, I mean, that was a really healthy energy for me to have. It's like, you know, I was really motivated to work on the needle felting projects because somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew it was kind of crazy, but I thought, oh, maybe a different life can come from doing these children's books. And it seems it's like so far-fetched. My wife thought I was crazy, and, you know, fair enough. You know, you got a busy life and you're spending your time needle felting, but you know, it has worked out well for me. I had the great pleasure of doing a Google Doodle this February. I don't know if some of you remember this or not, but it is from February the 17th, commemorating Laura Ingalls Wilder's birthday. She, of course, of Little House on the Prairie fame. And same kind of idea. Here's some behind the scenes photos. Here I am making that prairie landscape. Again, we wanted to find this in Vancouver, but we don't have this. We don't have this kind of landscape in Vancouver. So we were forced to build it. And there's my brother building the actual little house. Here we are doing interior test shots. And then finally, we took it outside to shoot with natural lighting. And it was January that we did this, so the light was very low in the sky. So I had to tilt the whole set to get a more summery angle of light, because it would immediately, you know, seem odd to have sun coming at a very low angle for this. And so we actually got bumped for a year. We actually got, we were ready to go for 2014, and then they said, oh, well, we have a conflict, so we're going to have to put you guys off to 2015. And we were kind of bummed about that. So our idea is, well, if the parents already love the stories, Pride and Prejudice, Star Wars, maybe they'll present these books with just that extra bit of enthusiasm. And that will make kids love books, love reading, and hopefully just be, you know, a good first step into a lifetime of loving books. So thank you very much for your time. This is the last image from Empire Strikes Back, of course. It's paired with the word goodbye, which is apropos for today. And I'd be very pleased to take any questions if anybody has any. Thank you. Yes?
So with the Princess Leia, like the different hairdos, like,
yes. For Princess Leia, she had kind of a, oh yes. The question is, how did you recreate Princess Leia's hair? And did you have to have, you know, different versions of her head or of her hair? What I basically did was had a very flat base of brown hair to her head, and then I would add extra pieces to that. So the buns could be added and removed, various kinds of braids and that sort of thing were added and removed. But she had kind of a flat base of brown felt on her head. But it was the same Leia head. Yeah, which is, you know, some of these felt figures take quite a beating while they go through the process of making a book, because you're sort of taking things apart and putting them back on. Yeah. Yes. Well, my brother and I, you know, I worked on Star Wars full time, and he still had a day job as a writing professor at Ithaca College. So we both did the needle felting, although I did the heavy lifting, but we both created the felt figures. And I did the set building and the photography in Vancouver. And because he's the writing professor, he's the one who takes the first crack at the words. And it seems a little bit silly. It's like, oh, well, you know, how hard can it be to write 12 words? But we actually had to go through many rounds of editing, if you can believe it, for those 12 words. Because it's almost like if you have fewer words, you have to get them perfect, right? Because they have to do a lot of work. They have to describe an image. They have to move the narrative along. They have to express, you know, Star Wars-y terms. So we had, my brother and I went through our own rounds of hashing out what the words would be. Then we had a round of editing with Chronicle Books and our editors there. And then finally we had a round with Lucasfilm. So, for example, the very first picture in Return of the Jedi is an image of R2-D2 and C-3PO just in the desert, just the two of them. And the word was robots originally, because we thought, well, that's the simplest word for children. And Lucasfilm said, no, we need the word droids, which is fair enough because that's what is used. But we just thought, well, kids are going to say, what's a droid? You're going to say, well, they're robots. But you know, they can learn droids first. That's perfectly fine. So there's those kinds of considerations that go into figuring out what the words should be. Yeah.
When Jack came up with the idea about let's do these books and distill it into words, had you guys already been needle felting as a hobby, or how did that come into the idea?
Right. So the question is, when my brother came up with the concept of cozy classics, had we ever done any needle felting? The answer is no. We had no experience whatsoever in needle felting. I had just seen my sister-in-law make some small animals or pieces of fruit, and it was just very tangentially introduced to even the concept of needle felting. Many people, when I tell them I needle felt, they don't know anything about the technique at all. So it's still gaining in popularity. But I just thought it might be something that I could try my hand at and see if I could create little figures. And basically, it's been a lot of trial and error to learn the techniques that we have. I mean, certainly if for some crazy reason we were offered Star Wars as the first needle felting project, it would have been a very different project than what it is now. We sort of cut our teeth a little bit on Cozy Classics. Like the very first Cozy Classics books, you'll see subtle differences. For example, certain characters don't even have eyebrows. They don't have thumbs. They don't have three-dimensional ears. Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, great, perfect. So we had to learn a lot of different, sort of teach ourselves different techniques, and things improved over time to the point that we could execute on something like Star Wars. So the question is that also the case with photography and model making? And absolutely, yeah, I would say yes. It's interesting because, with Cozy Classics in our first two books, you can look at them. There's definitely a very strong justification for keeping things very simple because, children who are very young, they can't necessarily process a lot visually. So you want to keep things very simple. So there's a kind of charm about the simplicity and maybe even crudeness of some of the work at the beginning. It works quite well. But then when you get to a Star Wars universe, people expect to see certain things, right? And so it became a much more complicated process of replicating something just as people know it. Because Star Wars, of course, it's a classic, but it's a visual text. Whereas with classics like Pride and Prejudice, people might have an idea of what things look like, but you have a lot more license to create things the way you want. And so Star Wars is definitely a challenge of replicating a visual text that people are going to be very, very protective of, right? Yeah, our techniques definitely improved. I'm also a self-taught photographer as well. So in terms of those techniques, certainly had to improve on those. Yeah. Yes?
Why the needle felting as opposed to clay? Like if you were to
The question is why needle felting as opposed to clay or some other way. To us, it just really seemed like we needed a technique that would, one, be appropriate for very young children, but that would be interesting for adults to look at. And that could be clay, but we have seen clay artists before in doing children's book, and it seemed a little bit fresher for us to do needle felting, and the plushness seemed to be something that would be appropriate for very, very young children, whereas the sort of the handcraft aspect would be something that adults would appreciate. So we were kind of creating books with a whole range of audiences in mind, and we were reviewed in Apartment Therapy recently, and they said Star Wars books are, and it said age group, it said 1 to 100, and we were like, that's very gratifying because they got it. These books are really for any age group. And needle felting for us was just, we thought, a technique that really sort of offered something for everybody. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, the question is, how long does it take to make the figures? The really complicated ones, Chewbacca, Darth Vader, are on the order of like 50 or 60 hours to make. And the smaller ones, like a little Ewok or Yoda, would probably be more around 20 hours. So it's very labor intensive. It's very labor intensive. Yeah. Pardon me?
Another revenue stream that not need to sell.
Yeah, people, the question is about selling the figures. Many people ask about buying the figures, and we would have to, well, first of all, we're not allowed to sell them, but even if we were, they would have to be one-off art pieces that, would, I wouldn't part with them except for some exorbitant amount of money because I put so much time and love into them, so. Okay, well, thank you all very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Holman. Any last questions before we wrap up?
Are there any other genres or stories that you would ever want to pursue? That's on your list of
Right. The question is, are there other kinds of books that we would want to adapt? We certainly have lots of ideas about what we'd like to do. We're doing more cozy classics, so we're doing more things in the public domain. We're working on the Nutcracker right now. The Wizard of Oz is coming out in 2017. So those projects are, and right now our cozy classics are with a Vancouver publisher, but they're all going to be reissued by Chronicle Books next year. So woohoo, that's awesome. We're really happy to be moving over to to Chronicle with cozy classics. There are other things that we would like to adapt in, something like the Chronicles of Narnia, Harry Potter, Little Pie in the Sky, but something like that. Right now for us, the question is, do we want to do more licensed projects, or whether we want to create something on our own? Because I think our felt figures might lend themselves to creating our own universe of characters that people can love, directly, not just be derivative of another franchise. So that's our question right now, is whether we want to embark on that project and create our own universe of characters. So.
Great. Thank you so much. It was a great presentation. We hope to have you back soon.
Thank you very much.